So today we are in the fifth lunch talk in the series of lunch talks on energy and mobility in transition. And today I have the pleasure to pass the floor in a few minutes to Professor Hein from the TU Delft, who will talk about the global petroleumscape and the energy transition through the lens of mobility in port city territories. And we want to highlight also some of the activities. So the BIVIC Gibbet Transport Research Days, they will take place in June 1 and 2 in Leuven. And I encourage you to stay connected with the association. So if there are other events that are popping up on our LinkedIn page of the association, you will find the announcement of activities also on the websites. And if you are a member, you will also be in the mailing list that will receive the announcement of further activities. So with no further ado, I will, with pleasure, pass the floor to Professor Hein.
And thank you very much. And thanks a lot for the invitation. I understand that many of you are transport economists, maybe logistics people. So I'm trying to present another type of view, and I hope we can have a conversation to see how we can bring these things together. So to give you a bit of background, on the one hand, I'm trained as an architect and planner, but my chair is in the history of architecture and urban planning. And one of my fascinations is the impact of oil on the built environment, which is a basic for mobility at this point. And the other is the role of port city territories. So the way that maritime flows change the built environment. And I would like to use these different perspectives and talk a bit about the work that we've been doing and to see what kind of connections we then can build. So ideally, I hope you should be now seeing my PowerPoint presentation. There we go. So one of my fascinations, as I said, are flows of oil and how they have shaped the built environment over time around the world in a networked way. Now, if you think about mobility, in order to drive our cars, our planes, etc., there's a lot of petroleum that will go from the Middle East to other parts of the world. And these flows are the reverse flows of funding in many places. So if we have mobility on highways in the US here, for example, on the one hand, you have the reverse in architecture construction, like Burj Khalifa, in other parts of the world. When I look at it from the perspective of architecture history, these events will usually not be seen in context. So they are observed as some different phenomena, and some people will write about the form of the building, and a whole different group of people will write about mobility. And maybe that's also what we are seeing here. So my goal has been to try and put space into these systems and look at it from a network perspective. So what happens if we put the industry of petroleum, the refineries, the storage tanks, the pipelines, in conversation with the gas stations, which are in some ways the kind of handshake between the oil industry and the everyday people, with the administration, which then often is also located in very different places. It looks different. It's the way where the finances are being administrated, but it also has a huge impact on how the built environment works. And then there are all what I call the auxiliary structures, and that depends a bit on which part of the world we're actually in. So in, say, in Iran, Europeans, BP, for example, built an entire city that was built purely to accommodate the oil workers, the expatriates, but it included everything from the hospital to the movie theater. And similarly, in places where we have a government that also runs the oil industry, say Russia or China, we will find everything from the petroleum hospital to entire construction of cities to facilitate oil drilling or other aspects of the oil system. Then there is infrastructure, which is a big part of mobility, but even the infrastructure itself is built with bitumen, with heavy oil, and is therefore also part of what I call the petroleumscape. And then there's the architectural scale, and we have more and more plastics in this in the whole development. I'm not sure whether you see also yourself and the reminders that pop up. I hope not, but I'm not quite sure if I can control this. And then there is also the aspect of philanthropy and welfare, where a lot of oil goes. And we see, for example, in the US, the Rockefeller Dormitory or the Rockefeller University, oil-funded institutions, and that goes all the way into musea, or even TU Delft, where we have also locations that are funded by the oil industry. Now, if we look at this as the foundation, as the petroleumscape in which modern mobility, oil-based mobility takes place, we see it matched by what I call the representational petroleumscape. That is the way in which these different activities are actually celebrated. So that goes from Hollywood movies on the role of petroleum, 3 Men at a Gas Station, and you can probably come up with other similar titles. And you have architectural or popular media or corporate media celebrating petroleum in multiple ways. If you're more interested in this approach, I can send you an article that we've written about it. There's a whole book on this theme of oil spaces. Now, for the purpose of what we are doing here, I would just like to mention a few more things, because we're talking about the transition. And this transition also requires us to think about, how do we deal with mobility of the future? How do we deal with petroleum in the future? And the case of Norway is for me an interesting one, because we have this example here, the Petroleum Museum in Stavanger, for example, that celebrates on the one hand the Norwegian history with oil drilling, etc., and its future. And in Norway, you see that the country heavily invested in a fund that supports even the smallest or the artistic activities, cultural activities in all kinds of places throughout Norway. So at the same time, where they are transitioning towards green mobility, green energy inside Norway, we are still relying on them, notably now also with the Ukraine war, because of the pipelines that run through the North Sea and that export the petroleum. Now, the question is then, what kind of narrative, what kind of story do we tell as we transition to new forms of mobility, new forms of energy? This is a case in Sydney, BP Park, where an old refinery and storage tanks were transformed into a park, but their whole labeling of BP was left in place, raising the question, how do we celebrate or not the historical petroleum sites? You could also think about this kind of rebranding that is going on through the lens of BP Bridge in Chicago, choosing a star architect, Frank Gehry, to design a pedestrian bridge and associate the whole with the name of an oil company. Now, this petroleumscape, and again, I can send you articles to look if you're interested in looking more into the argument and the history, etc., is linked, in my opinion, to particularly to ports. And where you can say water and oil don't mix, well, they actually do in the level of port city territories. And what I mean with port city territories is an attempt to rethink spaces as part of that connect sea and land. So to stop from a land-based national approach and to look from the seaside, because when we look at the Northwest European coast, for example, a ship can decide whether it goes to Hamburg, Rotterdam, Antwerp, or whatever, or Dunkirk, whatever. And that has, so that freedom exists, whereas if we look at it only from the land side, we will see the national policies of Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, France, etc. If we think about it through the lens of space, we always say that the ship shapes the port, shapes the city, shapes the hinterland. And to translate this through the lens of this perspective, is all the ships, the cables will determine how the port industry and the port side will actually look, how we warehouse. So when we think about traditional warehousing in the 19th century with old buildings, and those are no longer needed because we have container terminals. The administration, the infrastructure may stay in place, but we today have a lot of land mobility and dry ports in the hinterland of the country. When you talk to ports, many of these ports will argue that their biggest problem is not the port itself, it's really the hinterland and the hinterland storage. In the case of the Netherlands, the port of Rotterdam, in my opinion, reaches at least until Venlo, where you have dry ports, so where the logistics centers are. And you could even claim it goes all the way to Duisburg, where we have the biggest internal container port. How we discuss this story, what kind of mindsets, what kind of visuals we produce of it, is the part that is represented here. Now, my fascination with port cities goes also back to the fact that they are different from capital cities, in the sense that capital cities have a lot of public buildings, for example, ministries, government buildings, that are aimed to be monumental, that aim to be representative, but they also only have a power over architecture up to their own national border. A port city territory has always been accommodating global forces, flows of migration, very different types of people. And in general, it's a place where we have a culture of resilience. I would argue that very few port cities have died. And even if we have Belgian colleagues here, Brugge managed to build Zeebrugge to keep both the historic center and become a new leading port. So if these different stakeholders in a port city territory collaborate to facilitate the flows of goods and people, usually these port city territories benefit. So one of the things that we are facing today is, in the case of Rotterdam, for example, a decrease in harbor feeling. And you could say, well, why should that matter, particularly when you're thinking about mobility in the sense of transport? You could say we've managed to pull the port out of the city, Maasvlakte 2, all these areas that are far away from the city, and the city, the port doesn't necessarily want the city to touch itself, and the city has put its back on the port. But the challenges remain that you have to get the logistics through urban territory. And that depends very much on what kind of geography you have in each location, what kind of spatial planning you have. In the case of the Netherlands, trying to get the goods from the port of Rotterdam either by pipeline to Belgium or by train to Duisburg or by other means to Germany, have to negotiate every time the surrounding territories. Now, both sides recently have come to see the benefit of each other. The port, for example, human resources and the Port Authority know that they need the workers of the future. And these workers of the future, whether they are lawyers or whatever they could be, they're no longer the traditional port workers. They are highly paid people. They want a city where they can live in that is also nice for their family, where you have culture, where you have leisure, where you have good international schools. On the other hand, the city becomes more and more aware of the potential negative externalities of the port. And when you look at a website like windy.com, which shows the dominant winds, you can also add on the kind of the pollution in this area. So, for example, the NO2 pollution at a specific day, and I did not write, yes, here, Sunday, 28th, I didn't copy the whole, correctly the whole date out, but you do see that both maritime flows have pollution on sea level, and when you go a bit, if you were to go to the website itself and zoom out, you can really trace the pollution that occurs on the sea via ships. For example, the link between France and the Bretagne down to Spain, you see the pollution over the sea. But you also see the pollution that happens in the port of Rotterdam. So we can say, yes, the port has withdrawn from the city. It has built high walls. It's completely automated. There's little direct linkage to the people, but the pollution of this entire area is real. So the port remains attached to its city nearby in multiple ways, be it through water or air pollution. So this means that we have to rethink the ways in which a port generates value for the territory around it, particularly if we know that the city also needs to be the place where the workers of the port actually are. With that in mind, we can look at more complex data. And in the port of Rotterdam, we have the area of Pernis, which some of you might know. And Pernis actually has a relatively high life expectancy, which you wouldn't expect given this kind of air pollution. So once we start crossing data of air pollution and, say, high income or availability of supermarkets or good schools, you see that the positive and negative externalities get to a different level of balance. So yes, we definitely have to change mobility. We have to have less pollution on ships and on land, in the city and for the port. But at the same time, we also need to acknowledge how can we find the right balance to keep it between a growing economy and a better livelihood for the people. So this can mean have less transport in the port or have less industry in the port, or it can mean different type of logistics and mobility in the city, but there needs to be the right balance. So with that in mind, we worked on a number of what we call dualities, where the interests of port and city tend to clash or to compete. So one example, which is what we have been looking at, or we could be looking at right now, is that you have transport getting through neighborhoods, let's say from the port of Rotterdam to Duisburg, but it also crosses the neighborhood where the kids play. So how do you manage to get these kind of different values and interests into balance with one another? You could also think about questions of sea level rise, or you could think about education, which is closely related to what I was just mentioning about the kind of people that the kind of knowledge that the big industries would want to have in the port. Or you can think, and that's why I think port city territories are so interesting also in terms of mobility, are the relations between global trade, say big companies, China Shipping, Hapag-Lloyd, or whatever other big ones, the port companies, and the local authorities, which often cannot really oppose them. Even cruise shipping is another way to think through maritime transport, which also has a huge impact on the land relationship. Not so much perhaps in the port of Rotterdam, but if you think about the ABC islands of the Netherlands, for example, where cruise ships will show up, and if you discharge some 5,000 tourists, you block the entire development of the city. Now, with that in mind, we've done a couple of things that may be of interest. So there's an open access course, which is constantly running on a self-paced version, to think about port city territories from a perspective of space, society, and culture, with an attempt to how to bring people back to understanding this relationship between sea and land, of port cities and the areas, also the points of conflicts associated with this. There is a second of these courses, which is about water, called Water Works, which thinks about the notion of water and changing values today. Take a look at the website. So we have this group, Port City Futures, which is a collaboration between Leiden, Delft, and Erasmus. So it includes as much designers from Delft as it includes historians, anthropologists, economists, very different group to look at all these questions of mobility, development, urban development, port city territories from an interdisciplinary perspective beyond pure technology, economics, management. Now, I said already before, the idea is to start on the sea and to see the sea as a common good from which to then rethink the territory. And this is very much in line also with maritime spatial planning, which in my view is quite interesting as a component with or against land-based spatial planning. In this, there's a book which you can also find online called Urbanization of the Sea, where we've put the North Sea at the center to show what the North Sea currently is. Because in many ways, it's a blank space. When you listen to the municipalities in the Netherlands, everybody will say, oh, we cannot generate enough electricity or energy in our own territory, so we put more windmills on the North Sea. But the North Sea is already filled with petroleum, with flows, with wind parks, with ships. And we do not have a collective plan. On top of it, all this area is being broken up between the different neighboring countries. And that's very much different from the traditional ways in which we've looked at the sea. And let me just mention, say, maps with sea monsters, or the knowledge that people traditionally had about sea currents, or the way that the fishermen read the sea. So it's an attempt to bring back the sea into as a center, as a focus and a center of attention. Now, to show how these territory, what this means if you take a sea-based approach, what this means also for a historical development of port city territories, we have looked at London, Rotterdam, and Hamburg around the North Sea to identify why in these territories, which are part of the same sea and land-based mobilities, it's the same goods and containers that pass through, and the ports handle these same goods. And yet each port city has a different character, different history, different traditions. So we try to look at these three cities over time, starting around 1300, because that's when you start having meaningful maps. And rather than look at it just over time or to map the different scales, we said, let's take a perspective approach to see how port and city collectively developed with their infrastructure and their decision making and their territories. And if I summarize this briefly, I could say we see three very different developments. Maybe you can already, even from this is the historical development, and maybe you can already guess something. So maybe the port of Rotterdam is the biggest here. The London port is actually particularly small. Both of them have moved out of the city, versus the port of Hamburg has remained attached to the city. And this is way too small to see, but it remains within the boundaries of the city-state of Hamburg. And yet, I would argue that each of these developments is based on different, what we call path dependencies. So different historical institutional relationships and spatial relationships. In the case of Rotterdam, the port has always been in the lead. So the port expanded, as you can see here, infrastructures are built to facilitate port expansion. And the growth of the city, it's Rotterdam, but it's actually also Delft and The Hague and all these other little cities in Hoek van Holland that develop with it. So we have one giant port and a lot of urban territories. And this is where I think that we need to reflect upon how we name this. So rather than talk about the port city, we should, or the interface, there is no one port city in this case. There's actually plenty of cities and one big port. And the notion of the interface, which was coined in the beginning for the inner city historic urban waterfronts, it doesn't really help us understand this complexity, because it's more than an interface. It's a real threshold. It's a whole territory. In the case of London, we see that the city took the lead, and the city effectively was much more important in many ways than the port, even though Britannia ruled the waves. These were all private developments, and in some ways, the Port of London has escaped all the regulations and the conditions of the city, and the city has taken the lead in this whole spatial development. Hamburg is interesting if we think about it, because from the beginning on, the port was mixed into the city. So you see here these multifunctional uses. It was actually 3 cities with 3 ports. So we see here Hamburg, we see Altona, and there was a third one south of the river, which was part of the Niedersachsen. And in the 1930s, this was brought into one single entity, the city-state of Hamburg, which today, so you have a giant institutional entity where port and city form a tandem, control each other to a certain degree. So yes, Hamburg may not be number 1 anymore and is now whatever, number 4 or something in Europe. But the question is, how much value does the port generate for the city, and vice versa? So those conversations are now perhaps happening in Hamburg in interesting and novel ways. Now, to take this a step further or closer, we have also mapped the area of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp. And to my Dutch students, I would say that they probably haven't realized that they're in the second biggest petroleum hub after Houston. So it's all about cute little houses and tulips, but it's also about huge oil interests. And what this means, if we look at it over time, is that starting with 1862, the first oil ships arrive, sailboats with barrels of oil, imported by Pakhuismeester, a coffee maker, and stored on the east side of the city, so in the intake of the city. They realized a couple of things pretty quickly. Rotterdam will build the new waterway, which now celebrates 150 years as the access channel to the city. And they move the oil away from the other goods, such as coffee, and start building specific oil ports. So we see the similar development that I already showed you before, with the growth of the ports to the west, with oil in red, notably here the Walhafen, and the expansion in the 1960s and 70s, when Rotterdam puts up its finger more or less to say, we need new refineries in Europe, because due to decolonization, so to have energy security for Europe, we need to have our own refineries. And that's why you see the growth of these oil refineries in Rotterdam, where now about 3/4 of the port are home to oil activities. Now, any transition will have to, in some ways, undo this before we can really talk about green mobility or green energy. And keep in mind that much of what is here in the port of Rotterdam is channeled by pipeline to Germany and to Belgium. Because the fact that the Schelde River goes through Netherlands, the Netherlands said you cannot dredge. So the big ships in the 1970s can't get into the port of Antwerp. And that's why pipelines were built to facilitate these flows. Now, one more look at this entire story through the lens of the petroleumscape. And this tells us another story about the relation between port and city. So we see the storage, and this is 1910, the storage of oil, and we're still in the oil, in the lighting oil period. The dirty oil is in Rotterdam, but the headquarters are already at this point in The Hague. So you can't say, in my opinion, that oil is purely limited to the port. It is already near the headquarters. And the Shell administration actually writes a letter to the Dutch and say, we want our headquarters right next to the ministries, which they get. And you probably have seen in The Hague the nice old headquarters of Shell. Now, bridge building, infrastructure building, railways seem to always take into account the needs of the oil industry. And so this petroleumscape expands through the landscape. This is a map of 1940. And what I find fascinating here is that you see all these little orange dots, which are gas stations. So through archival research, we looked up gas stations. I'm not guaranteeing every dot, But what seems to emerge here is that we had way more gas stations in 1940 in the Scheveningen and Wassenaar area in The Hague than in Rotterdam. If that is correct, that would mean that by 1940, most of the car owners were rather rich people. And that makes a lot of sense, since Wassenaar up here in The Hague are the areas where much of the richer people live compared to the more working class areas of Rotterdam. Now, over time, in the 1970s, you see gas stations particularly grow in urban areas. I found it actually quite surprising. Delft, where I am, is the hub of a lot of exploratory gas stations, with several of them actually being built on campus. And by the 2000s, we have highway planning that actually includes gas stations. So the whole mobility plans for the Netherlands, the autobahn, the highways, were already conceptualized together with this petroleumscape. And why it matters even in terms of a green transition is when we do the similar mapping for green energy, we find that, again, the port leads in the energy transition. So by 2005, we have wind turbines here in the port area. But we also see the same socioeconomic differences, with a huge density of electric charging stations for cars in the rich areas of Scheveningen and Wassenaar, and not so much in the now poorer areas of Zoetermeer or any of the other new towns. So if we really want to have a transition, we need to take into account the structures that we have collectively built in the past, and understand what kind of legislation, what kind of spatial use holds us effectively back in changing into the future. So, for example, we see here in pink the electric overland lines, and changing these into something, even changing these that had been conceptualized for carrying electricity from a central part to a decentralized unit, to the user, inversing them is very much a problem. So any change that we really want to achieve, we have to understand and overcome the structures we've built in the past. So to really get to this blue economy, we need, in my opinion, to understand the oil spaces, how they work, and how they're anchored around the globe. If you're interested, this is I'm not going to dive into it, just to say this book is looking into the different layers of the petroleum industry around the world and how they have shaped our territories. So rather than, and why this is important is also because whatever changes we do in Europe does not mean that these same changes will also be happening in other parts of the world. So we can have new refineries here, but the petroleumscape, or the way where the companies gain their funding from, is still in many other areas of the world. So if you're interested, we can come back to this. And maybe one more point briefly to say about this slide. I've always wondered about wars and whether they really make a difference. What we seem to see here, for example, in the case of, this is the petroleumscape in the Americas. But if we were to look at Indonesia, for example, oil had been key to Dutch development. The Dutch colonies thrive of it. The Japanese go for Indonesia in the war because they want the oil. And even when the oil industry is destroyed, we see that these port and oil areas are rebuilt very quickly. You could ask, okay, what's the message in there for the future transition? For one, I think we have to acknowledge that the oil revolution, or the oil transition, and I'm specifically using these terms, was powerful also because it included everyone. It included culture, films, society. Everybody is thriving off it. Architecture built, landscapes built, suburban districts where you can only live with a car, which will be very different to rebuild and make accessible through public transport. So in some ways, everybody is part of this petroleumscape and it's functioning. So how can we come towards green energy, green mobility or blue mobility at some point, but while taking all these people along in the endeavor? And to take this to another level, I would like to introduce you also to a project that we're currently working on, which has the idea, again, starting from the sea through mapping to understand territorial transformation and to understand it from sea-based transport. So we've started from maritime flows, both goods and people, so ferries, containers, oil. And for each of the 4 seas, so the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean, we have compiled these flows with urban areas, with NUTS 3 areas to be specific, to identify 25 leading port city territories. With this idea, again, the container that is being transported through the territory is the same in every case. Yet each of these cities has its unique spatial, geographical, topographical, social, economic, etc. challenges. So when you look at, we're usually comparing, I think you too, because we're talking about Benelux, but we're often comparing this Northwest European range, say from Hamburg to Le Havre, as one group. But to understand how this entire North Sea region is working, we also need to see how a city like Oslo or Copenhagen interacts with these maritime flows and how they deal with the logistics from connections from sea to land and to hinterland. And for each of these 100 cities, we're currently finishing these maps, and the book should be out any month now. We're mapping a whole territory. Again, with this idea that if we really want to understand the flows, we have to start on the sea and we have to end in the hinterland and not just focus on the waterfront regeneration. In the case of Lisbon, for example, part of this area was rebuilt through a world fair. Another area, the former military site, is under reconstruction now. So there's changes ongoing. But when you look at this, you see also how the port areas are blocking access from the city to the sea. And that, again, is an interesting challenge, because many of the ports have traditionally expanded along the sea, but as lifestyles change, people want more access to water. And so these conflicts are existing everywhere. And you have the conflict of how do we get the goods or whatever is happening here into the hinterland. And those are the same spaces that the urban development is going for. And when you look at this, the atlas, I've been fascinated to see, for example, for the Mediterranean, and we've only mapped the European coast because all of this is European open access data, which we don't have for Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, etc. And ideally, it should be around the North Sea. But looking at this, if you think about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, for example, these will land in all these ports. But we also know that the European ports have to compete and cannot collaborate in the same way that the Chinese system, for example, wants. We have 13 out of the 25 leading ports are in Italy, yet, and these will be parts of the maps we're now making, yet each of them looks very different. So we are dealing with a Venice where we have a World Heritage Site in a lagoon, so very delicate ecological system, with the port of Marghera sitting in here in the back with all the needs of dredging to get the goods through. So this mapping is also an attempt to say, if we really want to preserve Venice, well, we might need to find different ways to serve the hinterland of this area. Or think about the Trieste region, which then overlaps with the parts of Slovenia and the ports of Koper, for example. Now, these are the maps that we are, again, currently building. This is Livorno. You hopefully can raise all kinds of questions from historical archaeology, which is in underwater archaeology, which is in the sea, and contemporary ways of shipping that often go directly over it. This is the case of Bilbao. So we will integrate all these icons for the existence of universities, of hospitals, again, of World Heritage sites, to hopefully have people ask questions, raise ideas about these intersections. Some of them are fascinating to see. We've got Antwerp here, whether you have a river port and you have a port on both sides is a very different story than a Dunkirk where you have a 360 port. Antwerpen is interesting also for this area and transnational planning, say for verdronken land, the drowned land of Zeeftinge. So questions of how do we give back land to water are all occurring right next to these logistics hubs. I'm using this also for my students as an argument to see how to think about architecture planning with water in the future. They will come up, and these are architects and visionaries, and I show you a few ideas. They are often very visionary and maybe not realistic enough. But the idea is that if we were to plan the Rotterdam of 2080, what would be the steps to take to get there? And in this case, the students had come up with everything from bird landing grounds in the port, and they imagined new housing district, new energy generation here through these shields that were flying in the air. So this might not be the answers to the new container or the logistics or the broadening of streets in the next 2-3 months or 3 years. But the idea is to give us an aim, to have a basis for discussion and a visualization of what this would mean. So some students may be becoming very dystopian in their projects, like this one, where they were actually thinking of self-driving engines that would clean up the soil, particularly of the oil industries, and then seed new plants that would continue this, grow a new park. Others took a topic from Naples, where the port of Naples is actually also, again, blocking access from this between sea and land, just in front of the World Heritage Site. And the Port Authority would like access to the hinterland, where an oil site is leaving, and the city would like the same site to reconnect with the areas near the Vesuvio. Now, if the port doesn't get the hinterland access, they were saying we will build a container terminal right in front of the World Heritage Site. So our students were playing with this idea to visualize it. If we bring another issue, sea level rise, into the question, the students then came up with the idea maybe we need actually a floating port, and here again in the Bay of Naples. Now these projects, and for them, your topic of logistic might be looking something like this, but other students went also in much more closely or carefully looking at the details. We are currently in a European lighthouse project, which is called the Bauhaus of the Seas, in which we look at 5-6 territories: Lisbon, Venice, Hamburg, Malmö, Rotterdam, and verdronken land, to see how we can reconnect between sea and land. And in that context, we are building a geospatial platform where we would like to have these clashes of different interests actually be made visible. So I'll show you a few more things and then I'll stop. As I mentioned before, there are a number of open access courses which are for free, so you can just hook up if you like, take a look, watch a few videos. You don't have to take them all, but I like to see them as a way of rebuilding, reconnecting port, city, sea, land, past, present, futures, and with new values. We have this as our website, the Port City Futures website, where, for example, we have podcasts, blogs, films, with one which is called Geluiden uit de Delta, where we have done interviews along the river from the North Sea to Rotterdam. A second podcast, which is called Frictions, which is in English, and that looks at port citizen communities that are opposing port developments in Valencia and Piraeus and different areas. That's a Marie Curie fellow who's been working with me on this. We've recently finished a serious board game, which we will bring to the UN meeting in March on water. Because for me, port city territories are really the place to look at issues of water. And for that, we've now started a new journal called Blue Papers, not paper, but papers, which will be handed out for the first time at the meeting in New York, where all these questions of water and it's a water focus through the lens of culture and society. So this is the first issue that is coming up, because I do believe that we need different cultures, values to do this reconnection that we've been talking about. So in case you are, we have been granted a side event in New York. So in case you will be in New York in the next, in end of March, do let me know, and we would love to have you join the initiative. I will stop there and wait for questions. I'll stop presenting, then I can see you better. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It gives us a completely different approach to the topic of energy transition and the oil dependency. I don't know whether anybody has questions. Please raise your hands. Then I can give the floor to the ones raising the questions. Maybe a first question from myself. We often, as economists, try to look deeper into the future on what will happen. So if you have to use a glass sphere, you've clearly shown that oil dependency has shaped our landscape. Do you think that if oil dependency gets considerably lower or even gone, that whether this still remains, that is old landscape dominated by the petroleum sector will still dominate also the future, even without oil dependency? Or what are your perspectives on that?
Well, in any case, it will be very difficult to dig ourselves out of the hole that we've gotten ourselves in. And that goes as far as, say, laws. We have made laws to facilitate oil drilling under the ground. We have property laws, how deep you own your land. It's really inscribed in the territory. So if we want a transition, it's not enough to put in a couple of new windmills. We really have to rethink the basis, the values, the concepts that are underlying it. And if we don't take the people along, I think that's exactly what we see now. We can do a lot with technology. And Delft's slogan, I always love to say this, is technology for a better society. Great. But if we don't take society along, the technology alone will not be sufficient. So if we want to dig ourselves out of this petroleum hole that we've gotten ourselves into, we need to think, in my opinion, much more broadly. And one of your colleagues, we had a conference at the SS Rotterdam in October, and Bart Kuipers, whom you probably know, said economy is there to make people happy. And I said, I'm going to repeat you on this. Because if that's true, we really have to take everybody along. So we have to have a transition that is just, that is inclusive. And that means also undoing some of the injustices of the past that we've gotten ourselves in. It's not really an answer to you, but it will be really difficult to come up with a new system where we also have as much buy-in and as much fun as the petroleum transition has given us. Because the question is, do we have to wait for a disaster, or can we really design ourselves out of it?
Yeah, and maybe related to that, if in one of your slides you show that the places where oil was first also, and where the pump stations were more the richer areas, and seemed also to be the ones that were the first in innovation of new energy resources. So I guess there is some kind of inequality induced by the petroleumscape. Do you have Are there any perspectives on counterbalancing this inequality, or do you have any suggestions to this end?
Well, so when we think about it in spatial planning terms, you could, for example, say that any intervention in these areas needs to be balanced with an X% in another area. So so this is this idea of needle pricks. If you invest in the port of Rotterdam, you also have to invest in whatever, Zoetermeer, I'm just saying something, so that you're not being only place specific, but that you're acknowledging the negative effects somewhere else. And that kind of thinking, you could even transform it into river basins. So often the big cities are at the bottom of the basin. There you have all the knowledge, you have the money, you have whatever you want, but the communities at the top who actually have to protect the water source don't have any benefit from it. And so this kind of thinking is slowly emerging, that we have to rethink in terms of watersheds, that we have to allocate funding. I heard recently of a case in China, for example, where you allocate funding to the top of the river. But money alone may not be enough, because often it's also about moral, societal values that people would like to see.
Okay. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Some questions? Please raise your hand if you have questions. Yes, Laurent?
Yeah, maybe one question on the whole infrastructure that has been built for the transport and refining of oil, etc. One question is, of course, to what extent this infrastructure can be used for alternative purposes. I'm thinking, for instance, for things like supplying in hydrogen. There's a lot of talk about importing hydrogen from faraway places with lots of sun. And so I have no idea about the technical aspects, but to what extent could that existing infrastructure be reconverted for the use of transporting other carriers of energy?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what's happening now, and in both ways. So coming back to your question, can we work ourselves out of it? In the Netherlands, we have this heating networks. We have the gas, so they're talking about reusing it for new energy sources. So that is fine, but we might also be just continuing it in some ways. So same thing with hydrogen. A colleague from Uruguay told me recently, so there's an African port which will then produce hydrogen to get it into the Netherlands. So we are reimagining this entire global network at a time when we're talking about circularity. So this is not yet, I see a danger of continuing what we've done in the past, just with a new type of fuel, but it will probably not solve the problem of well, then we need maritime transport that's also green, because otherwise we continue polluting the oceans, and that wasn't the goal in the first place. So it's not, I don't think it's solved quite yet. It's not, I think we need systemic change, and we need to think it as a system, and not just we have a new type of ship that gets the stuff here, but what does it mean then for whatever place in Africa where this is being produced?
Thank you.
I saw another hand coming up.
Yes, Sandra.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I really like the water as the starting point as a commons. And I was wondering, in this discussion of commons, there is usually a boundary. So I was thinking, if you think in a global boundary of commons, or if you think in a very micro scale, because I think it's very interesting, the analysis you are doing by joining the regional, like Antwerp, Rotterdam, but I want maybe to go to both extremes. What happens if we think in the water as a commons at a global scale, and a very and also at a very micro scale? And I was also wondering, like, in the new narratives about water as a common, if you have found, like, is this discourse going in which commons? Yeah.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, but also a very complicated one. So where, and I'm trying to give you an answer for partly, but if you start at the source and you think about watersheds, some countries, I just learned, for example, in Morocco, there's a whole, it's not a governmental entity, but an authority that is in charge of a watershed. And so within this watershed, they can say, now this area you cannot build in because we need it for. So if you let water lead your decision making, it's a different one than saying we have the technological means to get the infrastructure across, who cares, right? We have enough concrete to pump it into the ground even if the area floods. Or in the United States, where a lot of these areas, if the funding, if the people pay enough, you can even get into areas where you're not supposed to build. I mean, Katrina showed that this is a problem. So if you start thinking on a river basis as a watershed, and then you go towards the ocean, and then the ocean you see, or the seas, how the sea go further, and then you come to your question, well, where do we end? So the interesting thing by thinking it through water is that water flows. And I do think that we've been so much used to thinking about stationary things, at least architects and planners, our buildings tend to not move. So that we have to take into account, I mean, it's so simple. I mean, we see it now every day, but we think we map water often as a flat thing and at the same height. But we've seen it last summer, all of a sudden the Rhine is dry. We cannot get the ships across. Energy costs in Hamburg are different from the ones in Munich because the transportation doesn't get. So unless we have this more global thinking of water as a flow, of water as a commons, and that means even questions of land ownership. Who owns the border of a river? Who owns the river? Who should control it? Maybe the Rhine, what's it called? The Rhine Authority, which is a very old transnational authority. Forget the correct name right now. Or even newer ideas like Delta Metropolis associations, associations that are thinking on the basis of watersheds, rivers. I think that would be a very good way to move forward. Not quite an answer, but an attempt.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Professor Hein again for her excellent presentation. Personally, I learned a lot from this with a completely different viewing point on this important theme. So it was very interesting. And I will place the video of your presentation also on our website. So thank you very much for the excellent presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope that we can have conversations to link the economists to the more humanities, social and spatial sciences. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.